Welcome to the Lifetime at Work podcast. This is a podcast all about enjoying and finding fulfillment in your job and your career. We spend so much time at work. So how do we make it count? How do we make sure it's worthwhile? How do we know we're in the right place doing the right thing for us? I'm your host, Greg Martin, and this is episode number 1, the very first one, and thank you so much for joining. I ask these questions about work and career to myself all the time. That's why I started this podcast. And every week I'll be talking with someone new about their job, the good and the bad, and what the job means to them, what it's like to work in that profession. On this podcast, you'll meet people like you, people in jobs who are trying to make an impact and build a career and a life that they can be proud of. People trying to build lives that can give them what they want and be happy. It sounds easy, but it's hard. So have you ever thought about changing careers, but you aren't so sure? If you're curious about other people in their jobs and what it's like and if they're happy. If you've ever thought about owning your own business one day, working for yourself, or trying to make a bigger impact on the world through your job, this podcast is for you. So I have intro music, so let's cue that and then we will get started. Before we get going here, I wanted to point out our website. It's at lifetimeatwork.com. On there, you'll be able to see a list of all the episodes. You'll be able to learn a little bit more about me, but you'll also be able to sign up for our newsletter, email newsletter. And what that means is, in your inbox for every episode, we'll let you know what it is and if it's interesting for you so you can download it. But also, my plan here is to have you be able to connect with my guests later. Maybe you want to ask them a follow-up question. Maybe you want to connect with them yourselves. You want to have a Zoom call and meet them or meet them in person someday. I want to encourage that ability to talk to them and to create a dialogue and really a community around this because, through one episode, I don't think we're going to touch on every single thing that you may want to know or that may help you in your career and in your journey. So through the website and through signing up to the email newsletter, you're going to get more information. I'm going to include contact information in some way or another for every guest that I have so that if you do want to and you are interested in contacting them, you can. So go to lifetimeatwork.com. There you can see everything and you can sign up for the newsletter. So who the hell am I? Why me? Why did I start this podcast? Well, the thing is, I don't have all the answers to the questions I posed before, but I do feel like I'm at the intersection of my career, trying to figure out how I can make an impact and how I can get the things that I want out of my job. And so I'm going to tell you my background, so hopefully you can learn more about me in this episode, and through that, learn more about how I can help empower people and help people to get the most out of their work lives. So a bit about me. I graduated from Wilfrid Laurier University with a business degree. I knew I wanted to do something in business, not what I thought I would be an accountant, and I discovered finance and ended up getting a job graduating from school in investment banking. And right out of the gate, doing M&A advisory, I was working 80 to 100-hour weeks, sometimes more. And I told myself doing that I would sort of do it for 2 or 3 years and then quit and then go do something else. It would be great experience and I would learn a lot. And that did happen. But I found myself 11 years later still in investment banking. By this point, a director trying to move up further. And through the last, especially 3 or 4 years, it really weighed on me. I really wanted to do something else. I really wanted a different experience somehow. And I didn't really know what that was. And so one day I just decided, okay, I need to quit. And I had been planning a long trip with my family. And so we took this at least 6 week, almost 7 week road trip. We drove all the way with my then 2-year-old son and my wife all the way to Napa from Toronto, which is an incredibly long drive, and then up to Tofino there on Vancouver Island and all the way through Alberta and Montana and drove back to Toronto. And it was just this thing that I had wanted to do and always had wanted the time and the ability to sort of do it and finally could. And ever since then, I've been on this sort of journey, I think, doing a bunch of different things. And one of those things is going to tie in very well to this episode, because in 2017, I invested in a restaurant, and a guy by the name of Kyle Webster was the guy who was going to run it. I was just an investor. I was still working in my job at that time, and we spent a bunch of time, even from end of 2014, 2015, trying to think about a restaurant idea and develop it. And by 2017 we opened, and it took us a long time to find a location, but we ended up opening up by the St. Lawrence Market in downtown Toronto, right near a lot of the offices in the financial district. There's a lot of condos in that area, and the restaurant name was called Farmer. And the idea was to make casual food for people, but make it farm to table. So a really high end type of cuisine in the sense that it was from the farm and delicious and sort of healthy, but at the same time pretty affordable for people for lunches. And so we became, I think, over the years we kind of became successful in doing that and sticking with it. And it was hard at the beginning. We lost money definitely for the first year and a half, and I became sort of more involved in the business. And finally, there in 2019, we kind of turned a curve. We really got it going. We had a meaningful office catering business, which was growing like crazy. And meanwhile, all summer we had tourist season, and our food was just taking off. We had figured out a lot of the kinks in the business that just had to happen, and we had to sort of go through as a new business. And so through the summer of 2019 into the fall and into winter and Christmas, we were doing really well and had higher revenue than we'd ever had, and really figured stuff out to the point where by the beginning of 2020 we were contemplating an expansion. We needed to change our space and do a bit of a renovation in our space to be able to take on all the business that we were doing. And then all of a sudden, as you know, March of 2020 hit, and within a week, we had basically had gone to zero. COVID-19 changed a lot for us as a restaurant, and we've been closed since March with no real idea of if or when we will ever open again. We were just so tied to offices, and the return of offices needs to happen. Otherwise, our business really doesn't make sense as the way it was. And Kyle Webster, who I'm about to bring on in a second, is the head chef. He was really running the place and sort of still is, though, we aren't open. For him, he was a fine dining chef. He worked at a lot of top restaurants and around the world, and coming to Farmer was really an opportunity for him to run the place, really to have his own restaurant, but not to sell fine dining, to sort of sell a high quality meal, but at an everyday sort of price, and work with farmers directly and bring a farm to table type experience, but more of an everyday one. And we just aren't able to do that now. And it is sad, but there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot that we learned about the restaurant industry and ourselves, I think, in doing this. So here with that is my interview with Kyle Webster. So welcome, Kyle, to the first ever episode of the Lifetime at Work podcast. I'm really excited that you are the first person on and my first guest, because it really means a lot to me. I know we've worked together a ton in the last 3 years especially, but I wanted to talk about a bunch of things related to the restaurant industry and your experiences and what you sort of got out of the experience of running a restaurant and owning this business, really. But first off, I thought it made a lot of sense to talk about COVID-19 and its impact on farmers. So do you want to talk quickly about, the impact that COVID-19 has had on us as a restaurant and as a business, and why that might be a little bit more than maybe some other restaurants that are maybe not doing so bad right now?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me. It's kind of good to be able to come on and talk about, the work experience. I think the main kind of impact for us when we talk about COVID and how it's affected Farmer in particular, like we built a really cool business that was based around feeding office workers, healthy, high quality food that just there was a huge gap in the market, and it's something that just wasn't readily accessible in downtown Toronto. And for us, the landscape just completely shifted with COVID and people not being in their offices. And would you agree that's kind of the crux of how this has impacted us? The
Yeah,
most kind
totally.
of glaring underlying thing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it was a part, like the business really of Farmer was two. It was sort of a restaurant, and then there was also the part of catering, and that was huge. Kind of two things we had going on. It was both were big parts of the business, and both were really reliant on having people in offices. A lot of our lunch customers were
Yeah,
people in offices, and so you kind of just don't have that anymore. Like downtown just isn't the same. People working from home, as we all know. And it's just not they're not worried about it. They're not coming out and eating lunch in the same way. And from a perspective, okay, so we don't have the catering part of it. That part is pretty much on hold, but there's still a restaurant part of it, right? And like, have you seen, delivery and delivery services becoming more popular? I imagine. I mean, they are, but like, what sort of restaurants do you think are best positioned for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because that's true. We had this experiential piece, with the restaurant, with our patio and in our eat-in experience, and which was something we worked very hard on in terms of our customer experience. And as much as we had a utilitarian product with a value proposition that was based around eating healthy, it was still an experiential restaurant. And in reality, places that are based on an eat-in experience and a customer experience are not going to be positioned well right now. I think it's going to be extremely difficult over the next while to get people in with seating capacities and kind of get through this. And then that kind of plays into delivery services. Obviously, everyone has tried to shift to meeting demand in the home to trying to use delivery services. And I think for a lot of the higher end restaurants, it just doesn't translate. Their food is expensive. It's all made from scratch. They're making a really high quality product, but it's not meant to travel. Um, and I think that's something that we actually struggled with even before COVID. Delivery services are inherently made for the fast food kind of businesses of the world, if that makes sense. Like the food already travels pretty well. The expectation is also pretty low.
Yeah.
You're not going to be too chafed if your McDonald's meal shows up and your fries are a bit cold and you only paid, $10 for your meal.
Do you think there's like a perception out there, and I just wonder, it is just for me talking to people generally and anecdotally, but there's sort of this perception that the takeout restaurants and that, yeah, those types that are just ideal for delivery are kind of doing well right now because that's what everyone's doing. People are tired of cooking. But the bigger restaurants that have a lot more space, that rely on parties and rely on people getting together and selling a lot of alcohol and all that, they're probably suffering, but who cares?
Even at, like, let's call it takeout, the takeout level, which are restaurants that I think have definitely had a much easier time adapting with COVID-19 and the shifting demand for more kind of in-home and convenience stuff. I think, you look at like the McDonald's of the world, the Popeyes chickens, those big brands, and I don't think there's much of a similarity between that and necessarily a takeout place that was more, I guess, like Farmer or I think it's much more difficult for those smaller, more independent restaurants to adapt to this because, one, they're signing up to those delivery services at much different commission rates, and they probably just also don't have those big bank accounts you mentioned to kind of weather the storm. And I think it's the same at the high end. I think the Kegs, the Joey's, I think those restaurants are going to have a much more realistic chance of surviving through the winter. Going into this kind of, let's call it, fall holiday season, where a lot of those higher end restaurants do make a lot of their money, and then they go into a winter where they're, maybe break even or losing a little bit of money. There's a perception that some of the higher end restaurants, are really crushing it, but a lot of them aren't.
What do you think is the fate then of kind of restaurants in the next 2 or 3 years? I mean, we've sort of in Canada here been propped up with a lot of government help, which is,
Mm-hmm.
as the year comes to an end, is planning or expected to really decline. Like, what do you see like downtown becoming?
The number that's getting bandied about a lot is 60% of independent of restaurants are going to close, independent or otherwise, without more kind of government help. And I actually don't think that's unrealistic. I think it's probably, if anything, conservative in terms of an estimate. So, I imagine what we're going to see is a lot of places closing, which happened in 2008 as well. 2008, 2009, and the year immediately after was really hard in Toronto for restaurants. There's a lot of closures. And then the commercial, real estate market changed, and it made way for a new wave of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, like I totally see that happening. We're just, again, anecdotally, I'm talking to people and they're less enamored by the city, and it makes sense, right? I mean,
right?
you don't need to live there if things are closed, and if you can't, I think a lot of restaurants, like, you make money when the place is full and it's, at
Yeah,
capacity. And if we're talking about developing scenarios where it's 50% capacity or even 70% capacity, I mean, that by nature makes it that much more challenging for any restaurant to even succeed at. And maybe there needs to be an adjustment, though. Like, maybe rents ultimately need to come down. Maybe business models kind of need to change and people need to pay more for things. I don't know, but you would think ultimately it's not good. Like, it's not good for restaurants in the short term. But at the same time, I wonder if, and this is, I don't know if we're going to be at the forefront of it, or I don't know who is going to be. I don't know who's necessarily going to win. But I remember watching a documentary about Detroit, and they went through a ridiculous economic struggle for a while, and really
yep,
saw so many people leave the city, and businesses everywhere shut down. And I think even Anthony Bourdain went there and just sort of was profiling kind of all these restaurants that were now opening up, and they weren't, they were done out of the back of some house, or they hardly had a storefront, and it was, they were sort of these new businesses that came about. And I wonder if this kind of gives rise to those, potentially, in term, and maybe they aren't right in the city. Maybe they're out of the city where rent is a bit cheaper, but people are still super eager to eat out. I wonder, I wonder if that's kind of for a little bit the future of it, because I don't see like we're ever going to get back to busy restaurants in downtown anytime soon.
like there's a lot of, you bring up a lot of good points, and Detroit's a good example. Like it's the food scene there is actually phenomenal. I've spent time in Detroit, and it's actually great. The art scene is also very cool. But yeah, it just may be, the assumption that a rent in the suburbs is more expensive than downtown. Maybe that may shift. Like if you have a bunch of foodies who are in the suburbs who no longer have to go to their offices, and you're a young chef who wants to do a pop-up or something like that, are you going to do that downtown anymore? Maybe not. Maybe you just do it in the suburbs. Maybe that's where the demand is. So we could just see, a shift. Like, I think that there's long been an assumption that to get to the top of the restaurant world, both from kind of a creative standpoint, like let's call it like a prestige standpoint, you have to be downtown, and that may change. That whole thing may change, which is very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, I'm interested. So this podcast is meant to be about our jobs and the happiness we get and the fulfillment and the lives and the businesses that we choose to be a part of, and our careers and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to kind of put you back to thinking about when you started in the food industry, because you've been in it a long time, 15 years, I
Yeah,
guess,
like
maybe something like that.
13, 14,
13.
15 years. I've lost count.
When you were a young student, I guess, trying to think about what you would do for your career, what's the goal? What do you think of success, from just beginning?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because I haven't thought about starting out from the start in a long time. And like I think when I started cooking, which was probably 2007, 2008, so a long time ago at this point, the landscape was so much different. And this is another interesting thing that's happening with COVID, and the way consumer demand is shifting in e-commerce is, I think there's a lot more possibility for young people starting out in the food industry at this point in time. When I started, it was kind of, I guess, the Food Network thing was just starting to take off. Celebrity chefs were just starting to take off. Um, and so your food personalities were more like in your Julia Child mold, your kind of home cook type of people, as opposed to these rock star chefs like Gordon Ramsay was just starting to become popular when I started in the industry. And when I started, it was very much go work in the best restaurant possible, put your head down. You're cooking kind of high end French food based in French philosophy, and you try and get really good at it and become a head chef at a high end restaurant, and that was really the predominant path. Now there's different ways. There was always different ways of going about that, whether you want to be independent or you want to be corporate. But that was really kind of the goal. Um, and I think that's very different for people getting into food at this point in time. There's just so many more brands. There's so many more possibilities. There's so many more mediums, and it's just I think a lot easier to connect with people as opposed to before. Like you really just needed you needed a physical location, and people
Right.
needed to walk through the door.
Right. Yeah. 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 I mean, so did that? Do you think that you going through it, that you changed in terms of through your experiences and through all the restaurants that you were involved with, whether still open or since closed, or has just the industry changed, I guess, with social media and all the bloggers and Instagrammers and
I guess the other thing that is noteworthy when I started cooking was kind of the advent of the San Pellegrino top 50 list. Like there was always the Michelin star kind of community, but with the advent of cookbooks, the advent of social media and the internet, and the top 50 list, there was this. I think it really kickstarted what I would call the international high end cooking community. And you would thrive, you would or sorry, strive to go learn. I mean, the goal was always learning, and that was the culture, was just always, you need to work in the best places, doesn't matter what you get paid. You just need to learn, you need to get better. And the goal, the holy grail of these things was always to go work at these international restaurants that were rated on this top 50 list. You're talking about your Nomas, your 11 Madison Parks, and those types of things. So and I think for a lot of people who are very passionate about food, that's probably still the goal, is to go work in the best places possible, and then potentially open one of those things yourself. Because at the end of the day, um, cooking is at least at that level, is very much about creativity. So it's about, I guess, having a platform, and try to set yourself up to have a platform where you can be creative, where you can create your own recipes, your own dishes, where maybe you get that cookbook yourself, or you get these positive reviews, and people can come and experience, I guess, your food through your lens. And that's what the cooking at that level is all about. It's kind of cooking food with little to no limits, and doing it through your own lens, whether that's cultural, the experience of the restaurants you've worked in, or something you're particularly interested in, a sector of food you're particularly interested in. So I think that's still very much what serious cooks are looking to do. Now, I mean, for me personally, I started to become disillusioned with that world a while ago, for a couple of reasons. One, I just realized, as good as I was at cooking, I wasn't that good. I went and worked at one of those places. I went and worked in Attica in Australia, and the quality of the cooks was just exceptional. But it's also just the mindset you need to have. A lot of cooks and chefs think they're creative, but they're not really creating technique at that very high level, and it's extremely hard to do, and extremely hard to do well. But the other, I guess, two aspects of it were the exclusivity of it. When you're cooking at that level, the price point is extremely prohibitive to the average person. And I became tired of cooking food that the vast majority of people can't afford to experience. And I guess the last aspect of it was lifestyle. The work that goes into it, and this is part of a problem in the restaurant industry, is that the quality of cooking has become so good. The level that some of these chefs are cooking at, and some of these kitchens are cooking at, is so high that it's almost difficult, if not impossible, to cook that food without putting extreme stress demands on people, and doing it with a lot of free labor. But at the end of the day, it's just a completely committed lifestyle. You have to just be, work and nothing else. And it's hard to make sense of that when you're not really being compensated adequately for the work you're doing. It just stopped making sense to me at a certain point in time, I guess.
Yeah, like I definitely get that sense from there's not it doesn't seem like there's that many people making that much money in the restaurant business. Like when you kind of sit around it
No.
and you're there and you look at all the people who are in the kitchen, all the the people serving and just everything that goes in the back end and from farming and that whole, it doesn't really seem like rare that you say, hey, this guy's really killing it, or this group of people, it just really kind of get that sense. It's not that they can't make a good living, but it's just like you're saying, it just takes this incredible commitment. And it's not like, it's always, the compensation is always there per se, relative to
Hmm.
some of the other places. And I don't know if that's just part of just people wanting to do it. I'm intrigued by like why people want to do it. To a certain extent, like it's just, is it I've decided to be in the food industry, so now this is it. This is the pinnacle of it. I want to be here, and it's less about the money than anything else. It is more of an art and the accomplishment of the great dish, or being that great at such and such. And did you come away with that from working at Attica, because it's like a top 50 restaurant, right? Kind of,
Yeah, yeah.
and you see it on those
It's
lists. There was a chef's table
yeah,
episode on
yeah.
it, so it's a very
Chef's
cool
table. Yeah.
place. Like what did you kind of come away from that sort of thinking? I mean, did you your
Well,
next move after that, was it challenging? Did you feel like you had to, like how do you get the next job after that? I'm just trying to think of that progression and what it sort of taught you about the food industry.
yeah. I mean, I will say, from a career progression standpoint, working there. I mean, I was living in Australia at the time, and it opened a lot of doors. I was just there, doing an internship for a short time, and even after that, any job was really, a lot of jobs were available to me. It opened a lot of doors. But at the end of the day, where you take that progression, it's difficult because kind of taking a step backwards, talking about like why people want to do this, what's the goal, people not making money. It's the best comparison I have is sports. When you look at it, you look at sports, the the people who actually become pro sports players have either whether it's because of inherent physical ability or the amount they've put into the work. There's so many people who are extremely good at sports who don't make it there, and then they really don't make any money. It's extremely difficult to make money not being at that top level. And it's the same in cooking. There's so many amazing chefs and cooks who spend all this time working, working, working towards this goal, but they don't make it. And you only see this kind of tip of the iceberg, like this, 1% of these people who are on TV who have all these cookbooks, who even in a lot of cases still aren't really killing it. But to get there is so tough. It requires luck. It requires so many factors falling away. And so for me, kind of leaving Attica, I was there and I was like, wow, this is a really cool environment. We would have chefs from other top restaurants in for dinner, on a nightly basis. You're meeting all these people. It's incredible. There's people coming from other high-end restaurants. You're hearing about their experiences. You're doing this amazing food. It's just so good. But then, yeah, where do you go from that? And for me, I looked at it and kind of said, like, this is not the lifestyle I want. I think I started to become more enamored with trying to find ways to, work with certain types of food, working with, farmers, producers on a local scale, and making that sustainable while feeding, I guess, larger segments of the population. So for me, the reality is going to a place like Attica, while it was great for perspective, I don't think it really helped me in my career per se, in terms of finding a progression to a role that would really help me, I guess, be satisfied either professionally or stable financially, in the sense that I just didn't really want to go be a head chef at some mid-range fine dining restaurant and do that for the rest of my life, or become a corporate executive chef at you know a
Yeah.
Peg or a Joey's or something like that. I wanted to try and find a space where I could, I guess, interact with food and interact with a supply chain differently, which I guess was a large impetus behind getting involved in Farmer and what that project came to be.
Ever since we sort of came up with this idea and decided we wanted to open a restaurant and tried to figure out how to make it happen. And it took a while to find a
Took a
location.
while.
It was over 2 years to actually find a location and kind of pull the trigger on it. I remember, going around the city, looking at different places, lots of different places, lots of different
Mhm.
kinds, and looking at the rents and where they were and what we thought we could do in a given location. And just getting out, there's only so many locations that are even willing to talk to someone who doesn't have an existing sort of restaurant. Beyond that, there would be places that had $20,000 in rent or something like this, these ridiculous rents on Queen Street or King Street, and you just look at them and you say, you could make money in that location, but you really have to hit it out of the park. Like, everything has to go super well. Like, and we were looking at them saying, like, this just seems like such a big gamble. I mean, how can you do that? And how can you, pay that much monthly rent and make a restaurant work, especially when you've never done this before? And so because of that, I think it took us a long time, but then you'd see who would rent the place, and it would be some other person in a similar situation, some other group in a similar situation, and they'd be totally fine, taking on that risk. And then, you'd see the place open and do a renovation, and then, 6 months or a year later be gone. And you're like, yeah, I know, it was crazy rent. And these landlords were just, pricing this thing to fail in many ways. Because I'm trying to get at, like, there's some sort of romance, or there's something about the restaurant industry and wanting to get involved in it. And I don't, maybe you and I and lots of other people kind of get caught up into it, but have you ever thought about where that comes from and why that is? I mean, what it is about it that makes people say, hey, whatever the rent is, I will pay it, I will make it work. Like, let's just sink all this into it. Let me give up every Friday, Saturday night, and
Hmm.
all my time and all my money. What is it?
Yeah, it's a good question because it seems to happen a lot. And I think there's a certain naivety. I think even us, I think we came in equipped with a lot of tools. Your business experience, my experience in the restaurant world. I think even still, we were somewhat naive. Like, as you mentioned, it took us probably over a year just to come to terms with the fact that we weren't comfortable with one of those big real estate investments, and it was a great choice for us. And really allowed us to build something. Whereas the reality is, if we'd taken on one of those rents, we would have been gone in a year.
Yeah.
Um, but it just, I think people underestimate how much work it is. I think people overestimate size of the margin that they can, uh, you know, pull from any given amount of sales. And I think it's somewhat a field of dreams type of mentality where people kind of, get caught up in this thing and think, if I build this, people are just going to immediately flock there, which, we know isn't the case. It's hard to get customers to walk through your door, especially in critical mass. Like, as you mentioned, restaurants don't work unless they're busy. They have to be busy places. And I think people just drastically underestimate, especially with the amount of noise and the amount of competition out there with, social media, delivery apps, all this kind of stuff that you're competing with, how hard it is to get a customer and then to turn that customer into a repeat customer. But I guess, I think there's just something, people like going out to eat at restaurants. People look at the business model and think, hey, like, this isn't that complicated. I can do this. And it would be fun. I can tell my friends that I own a restaurant. I can, host people. And I know I've worked for some people who were kind of in that boat. They had probably a bit more money than sense, and um, you know,
Yeah, totally.
thought that it would be a fun project, and it's turned out otherwise. Like as you mentioned, I've worked at a lot of different restaurants, and I think at least 75% of them are now closed. And I mean,
Yeah,
some of
like,
them had good runs, but ultimately they're generally not investments that have a long life cycle. Which is a whole other aspect of it. Even if you create a successful restaurant, there tends to be a short life cycle for those businesses, and it's just in a lot of ways it's just not a good investment. It's just not the easiest way to make money out there. But I think there's something about working with food, being in that hospitality sector, that just really seems to bring people in. And I think from a very basic level, for people who work with food, like chefs, cooks, the whole Food Network thing, the lists and all these the publications, the Toronto Life, all these things, they do really romanticize the industry a lot more than it probably deserves.
Yeah, like hearing your answer to that, it kind of reminds me a little bit of probably early in the conversation when we were talking about the fate of restaurants. And like part of the reason for getting into this in the first place was a love for restaurants, and probably part of the reason you got into the food business was the same. And
Yeah,
you just love that. Like when I go to travel, that's what I wanted. That's what I think about first is
exactly.
kind of like, hey, I'm going to these restaurants, whatever.
Where am I going to eat?
And it becomes kind of the culture of the place. When I think about Thailand, or when I think about going to Panama, or any places that I've traveled, I really think about it through the lens, the food lens. Like that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And you know if we tie so much of our culture to sort of that and how we view culture, likewise we have COVID-19 happening now, and it kind of makes you realize that these restaurants are closing. Like traveling traveling is challenging in and of itself, but also going to restaurants when you're traveling is just as challenging, if not more so. And I wonder to what extent like restaurants are that. They're kind of are, in the year 2020, or maybe 2019 is a better example, our way of culturally expressing ourselves. And it's like, this is part of our culture. This is what we do. This is us. We're kind of become a society about food. And food is not more than just, feeding yourself, but it's more of an art. And so, that's why people want to get into it, is they want to decorate a place in their own way, and they want to hire a staff and come up with a brand in their own way, and make a dish in their own way. And that is, their way of expressing themselves. Does that any of that resonate with Farmer,
100%.
and kind of what you were trying to do, is kind of running the place and owning the place?
100%. I mean, yeah, again, it just comes down to that cultural lens, and it is a huge way of restaurants, food, they really do play a huge role in making up the cultural landscape of any community place. And the rate at which I guess the pressure that they're under right now, it does make it pretty scary. When you start to think that we could lose that, we could lose these cultural identities that are expressed through eating places. Um, and that cultural identity is stronger in some places, like for example Thailand, with just amazingly rich food culture,
Yeah.
or so many places like that. Whereas in Canada, we don't necessarily have that, but it's still a very, very important part of living in a a city. And it's even at a more basic level, things like coffee shops. Um, these things are important. They're yeah, very, very important to our cultural landscape. And yeah, for sure, I think the goal of owning a food business is totally to do something through your own lens and through your experience. And I think so much of my experience it comes from growing up. I grew up in the Belleville area, which is right near Prince Edward County, which everybody knows now, who's in the Ontario region as a tourist spot and a wine region that's very rich in agricultural history. And what a lot of people don't know is that at a certain point in time, Prince Edward County was actually one of the leading agricultural areas in terms of canning and food production. So the area itself is very rich farming history. And I was always working with chefs. Like one of my big mentors is a farm to table chef named Kevin McKenna, who worked with Michael Statlander, who is kind of the OG of farm to table
Right.
cooking in Ontario and
Yeah.
Canada largely, and actually one of the first chefs in Canada, or maybe the first chef in Canada, to hit that top 50 list that I was talking about before. So he was always a tremendous influence on me, and I was always working directly with farmers at the restaurants I worked at. So I think my upbringing and where I came from made me more interested in working with farmers, supporting local communities, um, getting real food on people's plates, as opposed to the forms and crazy technique, or creating these mind-blowing dishes, or these types of things. And so yeah, I mean, one of my major goals with Farmer was always to not only to provide Torontonians in an urban center with high quality food from local farms, but then also to support those farmers and support those agricultural communities, which I think is a really cool goal, and especially to try and do that at scale. We're not talking about feeding 50 people a night or 100 people a night. We were feeding, hundreds of people a day,
Yeah.
which is really cool. And you don't typically see that type of food in the catering space, particularly. So, and I'm really proud of that.
Do you think people value food the way they should? I mean, a lot of people think about it a lot. It's a big part of their culture, but everyone seems to want a deal all the time. Like I kind of, there's always ads when you think about any of the sort of the chain restaurants. Like really, they live and die by the various deals and the ads they have. People are, fiends for coupons. There was a program called Meal Pal in Toronto that was, I think it was something like, $6 a meal or something like that, and
It was cheap.
it was like, basically half price, basically meals were, around the city, and they give you a bunch of options for lunches. It seems like it's, being driven by like deal, like, that's kind of what it is. But there's something about, I think a deal that people are still kind of want. Does that bother you? Have you noticed that in kind of the food industry? There's definitely, no shortage of, companies or coupon-ish type, services that I think approached, us in the restaurant as farmer. But does that bother you? Have you noticed that?
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways that's one of the biggest issues facing the restaurant industry, and why it's kind of a bit of a broken industry. Because at the end of the day, everyone is still competing on price, and I think customers just don't. What a customer is willing to pay for a meal just hasn't really adapted as much as it should have. We talk about kind of the rising cost of food, the rising cost of labor, and then trying to pay a staff a living wage. It just doesn't work. And as you kind of alluded to, I think you see this. It's most prevalent, and I guess it's just more in your face with those big brands where they're just really competing on price. There's always coupons. You get McDonald's coupons in the mail every big brand. You're always getting coupons. They're always doing deals, running promos, and the food is just cheap. That's a big challenge facing the restaurant industry. And I think, the rituals and Uber Eats and stuff like that, and all these kind of third-party technology companies that are coming in and trying to offer new ways to access customers are almost making it worse, because they're acquiring a bunch of customers and kind of meeting demand for delivery and convenience, but at the same time, the restaurant margin is getting squeezed out of that. And at the end of the day, people already aren't willing to pay enough, potentially for food products. So it makes it tough.
Yeah,
It makes it really difficult.
all those delivery services are doing it like crazy, right? They're this is kind of the time,
Yep.
COVID-19, like everyone's doing delivery. Like let's make sure we get as much market share as possible, and totally. I still like being in and around the food industry for 3 years. I like something like all you can eat sushi. Like I just don't. A lot of businesses I go into, and I'm like, okay, I kind of. I understand a little bit now what you're going after, like, how you're doing it, your price model. And I go into an all you can eat sushi place, and I am just like, I don't understand it. I mean, I can't understand how they can make money. And there's many that have been open for a long time. And so clearly, they must be doing something right. And I don't know, have you seen the Tiger King documentary
Yep.
thing? So in there, for anyone who hasn't seen it, in there, the Joe Exotic was feeding his tigers mostly with expired Walmart, meat. He would basically go to Walmart, buy all of their meat that had expired,
Yeah.
as cheaply as
Yeah.
possible.
The
And
Walmart
then,
trucks.
right. And then, freaking out when all of a sudden, a shipment didn't come in. But then he opened a restaurant at, his place. And then, and this kind of, they allude to the fact, I don't know how clear they say it, but they're sort of like, well, he must be using the meat for that, right? Like, it's just like, he's got all this extra expired Walmart meat. You must be using it at the restaurant. And it just kind of got me thinking about going back to it. Like if, just back to that connection with the restaurant and how far that is from all the stuff that we're talking about, understand, willing to pay for things, farm, all those sorts of things. And it really freaked me out. Of all the things in that documentary, I was sort of like, oh man, what, potentially what are we eating?
Funnily, I kind of glossed over that whole part of it.
He does go back.
But
He opens a restaurant, and I don't think it's very successful because it probably was all expired, terrible tasting meat. But it was like pizza,
Walmart meat.
maybe hot dogs. Yes, it was. You're just like, what is he putting on that pizza?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good, point, and it's something to think about. And in North America, I think our food system is a little bit broken in the sense that we're eating more processed food than anywhere else in the world by a fairly long shot. And there's all these sustainability issues with seafood and overfishing, as well as eating red meat and greenhouse gas emissions, and people are trying to eat things like grass fed and free range and factory farming, and there's all these things, and people are inherently, when people see these factory farms and all these cows or all these chickens, in these terrible environments, they're inherently appalled by it. But when it comes time to pay for something, they're, in reality, those are the choices that we're making more often than not. And I think one of the concerns with people deal hunting and people not being willing to pay more money for food, and the all you can eat sushi is a perfect example. There's no way they're using sustainable fish for that. They're going to be using, the cheapest fish that's available on the marketplace.
Yeah,
Because
I don't.
otherwise, there's no way you make money.
No one cares, though. I guess like that's what you're saying. People are basically saying they don't care, right?
Yeah,
By going to those
they
places, like they're not. It's not what you're going after. You're trying to get. You like sushi, but you don't want to pay much because it's expensive, right? It's expensive stuff.
it's expensive. Yeah, exactly. And so, it's a challenge. I think just kind of facing our food systems in general is just, if people want independent farmers to exist, you can't just want to buy the cheapest food possible, because it's not going to come from your local farm or the farmers market. It's just not realistic. If people want something like grass-fed beef, or they want antibiotic hormone free, it's just, you're just not going to be able to purchase that at these like rock bottom prices, right? So I think there is this element where consumer mentality and how much they're valuing food needs to probably change. When you think historically, like, I think I read a statistic once that, over time, like just kind of history, the vast majority of people's disposable income would have been spent on, food and shelter, but, mostly feeding their families. Whereas now, I think it's below 10% of people's disposable
That makes
income
sense. Yeah.
is spent on food, which is kind of shocking. We're buying, everyone goes on vacations and buys cars and TVs and things for their houses and all this kind of stuff. But our food budget is inherently low, and it's definitely historically low in terms of a percentage of disposable income. So I mean, it's just an interesting thought that people don't seem to value food experiences as much as they probably should, or even just at a more basic level, don't probably aren't willing to invest in even just feeding ourselves and our families as much as we probably should. But it's definitely a big problem for the food industry, and particularly the restaurant industry right now.
So I don't have too many more questions for you, but there's one that I don't think I've ever asked you, and wanted to, and that's about, getting a review, getting a bad review as a chef, and like I was just going through some of the reviews from Farmer, and I think 4.5 to 5 stars out of 5 stars is generally like what you would see on basically all the platforms. I mean, it's there's some great.
Yeah.
At the same time, there are some bad ones. Like I just have a few here that I picked out. There's one that said, it literally says do never go to that place. They don't, and it goes order online, take almost forever. They don't care if the driver is waiting. Like so this was clearly a delivery gone wrong or something, and the person decided
Yeah.
to say it. Another one though was, the food was disappointing, lacked flavor. There was no real thought to how it was presented. I should have gone to the St. Lawrence market. You just get these kind of like reviews of people who are just like, just upset and attacky and whatever. And then, on the flip side though, we'll see, a vast majority of the reviews are, and I pulled out some good ones too, this is a hidden gem, fantastically locally sourced restaurant. You can literally taste the goodness in their food. It's easily my favorite restaurant in all of Toronto. So you get those too, but I imagine the negative one just sort of weighs on you that much more. What does it feel like to get kind of a bad review?
Well, it's funny you say that, because especially at a certain point in time, I mean, keep in mind there's a point in time before user reviews. And
Yeah.
so that's been a positive and a negative, I think, for the restaurant industry. Before that, you were solely relying on media reviews. So, when, the process of opening a restaurant, you knew that within the first 6 months, sometimes really fast. I remember opening a restaurant in in Toronto, and we got reviewed within the first 2 weeks, which is cruel because no one starts out really firing on all cylinders in the first two
You
weeks.
didn't have it all figured out, probably. No, no,
No,
no.
no, you really don't. But you live and die by those, and if those reviews are bad, your business is essentially done. You're never really going to make it. So they hold so much power. And now with user reviews, that's changed, especially for kind of like fast casual restaurants, like in our space and stuff like that. But then your customers have a tremendous amount of power, and even some of them we get great reviews, but they'd only give us 4 stars, and they don't realize that that's actually bad. Like it needs to be 5 stars.
Right.
Um, otherwise it just doesn't work. So it brings down our rating. So but in general, I think the first couple times you get one of those terrible reviews, like inherently you're in hospitality to make people happy. That's your end game, and really what you're selling is an experience. You want people to come away very very satisfied. And so when they don't, you do take it to heart, especially because you put so much time and effort into it. But I think over time you start to, I guess, develop thicker skin, and you start to not really focus so much on the negative reviews because at the end of the day, some people are always going to find something to complain about, and especially on your Googles and your Yelps, there are just people who just complain, and that's what they do. They just go on those review things and they just kind of poke holes and everything. So you learn to separate out what positive, like what positive feedback you're getting, and ways to improve, because it's important. It's important to get that customer feedback and try and continuously improve, and kind of separate that out from people who are just straight up you know being mean. um, and then just focusing on all the positive reviews, because if you're doing something right, you're going to get overwhelmingly positive reviews. So but yeah, the first couple, they really sting.
No,
I'm not gonna lie,
I know.
it's tough.
They sit with you. You kind of need like 5 or 6 really good ones to kind of cancel out one bad one. I find it just sort of
Yep, yep.
in that, I don't know, just in your head, it really, especially when they come out like that. So do when you're eating somewhere and a server comes and they ask you like how the food was, like do you, or how honest are, like, because you don't want to lie to the person and say, hey, the food was great when it was awful, or do you have like a strategy or a tact, or do you, um how nice are you, and do you ever break it to them that, hey, this is not good, but obviously in a nice way?
You mean when I'm eating out somewhere?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I have a really hard time with giving feedback. I think because I'm so sympathetic to it. I probably to the point of fault where sometimes I'll just put up with something that's just wrong, and not tell anyone.
Right.
I got to admit that the years of being in the industry have made it very difficult for me to complain. Because I also feel bad, knowing that there's a cook or a server or someone who's probably going to get in quite a lot of trouble for whatever your complaint is, and they're generally stressed out and not necessarily having the best day in the first place. So I'm
Right.
pretty sympathetic to it at this point. I'm not a very good complainer, I got to admit.
So I just wanted to sort of end this with, we're kind of in the spot, and we haven't talked really much about sort of what we're up to now at the restaurant, because effectively, as a restaurant, we've been closed, and remain closed because it's a struggle to sort of think about who would come and why they would, and just that it would be enough to make it a meaningful business. And so I think we're looking at the very real possibility that, um, that we never do open, and that we've been working on some other things in and around the prepared meal space, and that doesn't has nothing to do with where the restaurant is located. It doesn't need to be there, and so there's just a ton of different scenarios, I guess, that could happen. um, I guess kind of two parts of it is, one is like, how does it feel that and I personally don't even know how it feels. I kind of, I'm not sure. I go through lots of different emotions, but how does it feel to sort of be confronted with that? And then, on the one hand, and then And then two, is there any way, going through sort of all that we've gone through in terms of, you know, one, getting to know each other, but developing an idea, opening a restaurant, kind of all the trials and tribulations, going through all the bad reviews, all the good reviews. Even if Farmer never is successful as a restaurant, and by successful, I guess I just mean financially. Do you still think that it can be a success? And how do you sort of think about that as a project, as a 2-3 year endeavor?
Mm-hmm.
As actually being something that was successful as a restaurant.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, as this, podcast is kind of about work and work-life balance and finding meaning in work, it's definitely been an emotional few months and in a thought-provoking few months ever since kind of COVID hit, because we've gone from having this, what I would consider impactful business, both from I would say three standpoints. One, I think, as I mentioned before, we had this, great supply chain where we were, positively supporting a bunch of cool, local businesses. Yeah, we were providing real value for Torontonians in the marketplace, and we were selling a lot of food, and our growing success at the time that COVID hit was really indicative of that, and that we were really finding a good niche in the marketplace. And then I think as a hospitality business, I firmly believe that we were, a good place to work, a positive place to work. We were providing people with, good work-life balance, which is not very common in the food and restaurant industry. And so I think, from our supply chain, our customers, our staff, and our team, we were really doing a lot of positive things and really creating a positive impact. And then, I think for us personally as founders, I mean, for me anyways, it was an incredible growth experience, one way or another. And I mean, even trying to navigate COVID from a certain context has been a pretty amazing learning experience.
Still
And
ongoing. Yeah.
hopefully we don't have to do that ever again in our lives. But um, it's been incredibly, satisfying and an incredible learning experience. So when you kind of look at it and go, okay, well, worst case scenario, we have to shut the business and we all have to move on and go do something else. And you start to wonder, like, okay, well, what's next? And I think from a work standpoint, you start to look at the different options, and it becomes very difficult to try and pinpoint something that's going to be as meaningful. Like how as an individual do you just go somewhere and create this much value? And for me, that's a really tough question to answer.
Yeah, no, I don't have any answers, but I appreciate you joining the podcast. This being the first episode, I'm sure it's clunkier than some of the other ones, but if anyone listening has made it this far, I appreciate it very much as well. And yeah, it can only really go up from here, I think, in terms of
I think so.
clarity and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, anyways, Kyle, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast, having a chat, and really all these years for working together. It's been amazing. I think we've learned a ton about the food industry and just business in general. And yeah, I struggle to think of how in that way we can't think of it as a success. So it remains to be seen where it goes and what we see from now. But at the very least, thanks for joining the podcast, and I'll see you soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Greg, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. We'll talk soon.
So that concludes my interview with Kyle Webster. Thank you so much for listening. One thing we didn't mention on the interview was what we're doing now, which is a prepared meals business. You can always check us out, farmr.ca, if you want to see what we're doing now. It's kind of a work in progress. We're working on a frozen meal business that is brand new, and we just didn't have the chance to talk about in this episode. But thanks so much for listening. Please check on our website at lifetimeatwork.com. You can there stay up to date on all the new episodes and also subscribe to our email newsletter. As well, this is a new podcast, a new brand new everything. So if you can tell your friends, or if you think there'd be someone out there that would benefit from listening to the podcast, I'd highly appreciate it if you recommended us. Also, you can post this on social media or give us a review on your favorite listening app. Any of those things like really, really help me out. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.